following video looks at the poem Easter 1916 by William Butler Yeats in line with the Jesuit tradition of deeper learning embedded in the Ignatian pedagogical principles of context, experience, reflection, action, and evaluation. It provides a brief overview of the poem's themes, structure, and language features present and is intended for HSC Advanced English students of St Ignatius College who have read and formed their own understanding of the poem. In order to understand Yeats's work, it is essential to have a thorough understanding of his character and key influences. An understanding of Gaelic legend and the events of history are also vital to the understanding of Yeats's thoughts, images, and symbols. Yeats's philosophy was influenced by a variety of factors, including the occult, Neoplatonism, Hinduism, Christianity, Nietzsche, William Blake, and many more. Yeats's fondest childhood memories are in the northwest Irish countryside of Sligo, where he would visit his grandparents. He was interested in the stories of the local people. Much of his early poetry is based in Irish myth and Celtic legend. He continued to crave for Sligo long after his family moved away. He missed his cousins and uncle dreadfully and longed for the intangible magic of its wild, dark earth and changing skies. This place was one of many key influences on the poet. Yeats was also largely influenced by the people he met. In 1885, he met John O'Leary, a Fenian leader. O'Leary was so significant that Yeats claims that from O'Leary's conversation and from the Irish books he lent or gave me has come all I have set my hand to since. In his writing, Yeats presents a series of contradictions, most notably between Romanticism and modernism. By the accident of his date of birth, Yeats lived into the modern age, which arrived violently after World War I and the Civil War in Ireland at the same time. He was both one of the first moderns in poetry and one of the last romantics. However, he always saw himself as a romantic. This is clear from his own statement, where he says, "We Irish, born into that ancient sect, but thrown upon the filthy modern tide." He was openly opposed to modernism, which he saw as a slide downward into material chaos brought about by a neglect of spiritual values. He believed that modernism encouraged habits that undermined imagination. He believed it dislocated people from idealism and value, which he saw as still within Ireland. However, Yeats was also contradictory in his relationships with Ireland. This love-hate relationship stemmed from a variety of influences. Nationalism was widespread in all its forms in Ireland at the time, but Yeats preferred romantic literary nationalism to the new insurrectory nationalism of his great love, Maud Gonne. He saw Irish history from two perspectives. While he supported Irish independence from Britain, he was appalled at the violence which achieved it. While he was inspired by the idealism of the heroes of his time, he was maddened by the complications and hypocrisies of politics and the narrow-mindedness and imperfection of leaders. His father came from a strong tradition of devotion to the arts and spirituality, whereas his mother came from a heritage of vigorous action, and Yeats admired both approaches. Due to the influence of the 19th century thinker and poet Matthew Arnold, whom he admired, he saw the Irish as not English or opposite to English. However, it is important to note that Yeats was not only reacting against England, but the Irish middle classes. He saw their values as antithetic to ideals of community and aristocracy. He shows a disdain towards the mercantile middle class, whom he saw as not having values. These fascinating tensions and conflicts are reflected in his work. Yeats first published his work in 1888 and soon began to be accepted as an authority on Irish folklore and a poet of importance. Some would even say the foremost writer of the Irish Renaissance and a prime supporter of Irish nationalism. Yeats's greatest achievement was the part he played in the Irish literary revival. We must remember that Yeats lived through a tumultuous period of history. He lived through war, revolution, and violence. And understandably, the romantic wistfulness, the dreamy, decorative quality of much of his earlier verse eventually gave way to a matter at once more terse, astringent, and masculine. During Holy Week in 1916, a group of Irish rebels seized the General Post Office in Dublin and held it for several days. They were fighting for the establishment of an independent Irish Republic. Yeats composed Easter 1916 within a few weeks of the execution of the leaders of the Rising. Ironically, Yeats was in London when the events occurred, but he couldn't ignore these political events as much as he wanted to. The subsequent crushing of the rebellion and the harsh sentencing of its leaders united public opinion behind Sinn Féin's aspiration of Irish independence like nothing before. It was the ferocity of the British reaction and immediacy of the deaths by firing squad of the rebels which turned the tide of public opinion. They were executed on the 9th of May, and Yeats had already started writing on the 11th. The principals were mostly people he knew personally, and his own future hung in the balance. Due to the wholesale execution, Yeats became sharply critical of the British government. However, due to a variety of influences, Yeats's attitude towards the event remained ambivalent. In a letter to Lady Gregory, he wrote, "I feel that all the work of years has been overturned, all the bringing together of the classes, all the freedom of Irish literature and criticism from politics." While Yeats condemned the violent approach of the rebels, he strongly supported William Blake's concept that oppositions were necessary to human existence. In Blake's famous words, "Without contraries is no progression." This accounts for his reaction to what the lives of the martyrs were and what they became, as expressed in his poem. Through Easter 1916, Yeats explores the difference between history and mythology and tries to find meaning from all this upheaval and chaos. In his poem, he seeks a way of mythologizing historical events. We witness his shifting attitude towards both himself and the heroes of 1916. We see a developing appreciation of the way that the rebels have transformed his world. The poem can be seen as a tribute to the rebels or an indictment of fanaticism. He recognises that everything has changed, maybe for the better or maybe for the worse. Ultimately, Yeats is trying to come to terms with this historical tragedy. You'll now hear a reading of the poem, and I'd like you to keep these contextual influences in mind as you listen.
Easter 1916 by W.B. Yeats. I have met them at close of day, coming with vivid faces from counter or desk among grey 18th century houses. I have passed with a nod of the head, or polite meaningless words, or have lingered a while and said polite meaningless words, and thought before I had done of a mocking tale or a jibe to please a companion, around the fire at the club, being certain that they and I but lived where motley is worn, all changed utterly, a terrible beauty is born. That woman's days were spent in ignorant goodwill, her nights in argument until her voice grew shrill. What voice more sweet than hers, when young and beautiful she rode to harriers? This man kept a school and rode our winged horse. This other, his helper and friend, was coming into his force. He might have won fame in the end, so sensitive his nature seemed, so daring and sweet his thought. This other man I had dreamed, a drunken, vainglorious lout. He had done most bitter wrong to some who are near to my heart. Yet I number him in the song. He too has resigned his part. In the casual comedy, he too has been changed in his turn, transformed utterly, a terrible beauty is born. Hearts with one purpose alone, through summer and winter seem enchanted to a stone to trouble the living stream. The horse that comes from the road, the rider, the birds that range from cloud to tumbling cloud, minute by minute they change. A shadow of cloud on the stream changes minute by minute. A horse hoof slides on the brim, and a horse plashes within it. The long-legged moorhens dive, and hens to moorcocks call. Minute by minute they live, the stones in the midst of all. Too long a sacrifice can make a stone of the heart. Oh, when may it suffice? That is heaven's part, our part, to murmur name upon name, as a mother names her child when sleep at last has come on limbs that had run wild. What is it but nightfall? No, no, not night, but death. Was it needless death after all? For England may keep faith for all that is done and said. We know their dream enough to know they dreamed and are dead. But what if excessive love bewildered them till they died? I rout it out in a verse, Macdonagh and Macbride, and Connolly and Pearse, now and in time to be, wherever green is worn, are changed, changed utterly. A terrible beauty is born.
Boys, I'm now just going to move through the poem stanza by stanza and point some things out. Stanza 1 describes the Dublin streets and the lives of himself and the Dubliners in an almost dreamlike comedy of errors. It conveys his belief about these ordinary men before the extraordinary events of the rebellion. You'll notice that a dramatic motif runs throughout the poem, starting off as a comedy and transforming into a tragedy as the events unfold. You can see from the use of the first person pronoun, I, from the very outset, that this will be a personal poem and is about more than just the events. It's not simply a recount of the rising itself. It's about Yeats's personal response. The present perfect tense of have met, have passed, and have lingered is cleverly chosen by Yeats. This particular tense, as opposed to past simple tense, he could have said, I passed, I met, I lingered, makes a link between past and present and suggests that Yeats's present response has changed as a result of his experience. The contemptuous use of that third person pronoun, them, they, and the small talk of polite, meaningless words suggests Yeats' initial apathy that changed after the Easter events. Consonants of the letter D in I have passed them with a nod of the head, almost mimicking the action of nodding, and the repetition of polite, meaningless words conveys the mundane, meaningless emptiness of his past interactions with these people. This is reinforced by the way that he describes how he would entertain his other friends at the club with a mocking tale or a jibe about these encounters. This mocking tale and jibe can be contrasted with his use of song and verse later in the poem. He seems to be, in this first stanza, condemning his past actions, and there's a sense of transformation, which is why the present perfect tense is so effective here with its uniting of the past and the present. In this opening stanza, readers are in the presence of a modern metropolis, in this case Dublin. Yeats likens the Dubliners' vivid faces to those of actors, and their backdrop is the counters, desks and 18th century houses. It's reinforcing that theatrical motif. Likening of the Dubliners' clothes to motley alludes to the fool's or the jester's clothes in a comedy, the costume that the fool will wear. The imagery of drama being used again. You'll notice later that these ordinary citizens are transformed into revolutionaries. The reference to motley might also be giving an insight into his perspective of the rebels. You know, he might be this might convey that he was thinking that maybe their actions were foolish, and thus the reference to motley, that it was a meaningless sacrifice. I think he's still coming to terms with these ideas. This stanza, the first one, closes with the sonorous, powerful refrain, all changed, changed utterly, a terrible beauty is born. The overstressing of the syllables and that the plosives in changed, terrible and beauty emphasise the dramatic nature of the event and how sudden, violent and abrupt the change was. Yeats's world had been utterly transformed. There's a total break with all past ideals, beliefs and concepts. He, The rebels and Ireland have changed utterly because of the rebels' actions. The oxymoron, terrible beauty, is exemplary of his ambivalence towards their sacrifice and the tragedy. It might also be an allusion to the Christian tradition of Easter, which represents both sacrifice of Jesus' life and resurrection or hope. But I'll let you decide whether you think there's a connection there. We now turn our attention to the second stanza. Stanza 2 lists the leaders of the uprising and describes their pre-uprising behaviour. Yeats was more interested in art than politics and their possibilities as artists and writers, and this comes through really strongly in this stanza. The stanza suggests how difficult it is for Yeats to reconcile what he knew of them with what they have become. These four characters who he refers to were not the most obvious figures from the rebellion. Marjorie Perloff, who wrote the article entitled Easter 1916, asserts that their inclusion was because of Yeats's personal connection and describes the poem as more mythography than realistic document. Helen Vendler, in Our Secret Discipline, Yeats in Lyric Form, describes the listing of the characters as the dramatis personae, like the listing of players at the beginning of a play, again returning to that extended metaphor of theatre. We notice in this stanza that Yeats becomes a little bit more particular. Rather than the vague and distant them and they, he personalises the rebels and gives descriptions of them. That woman is Markovitch. This man refers to Pierce. This other, MacDonagh. And finally, this other man, MacBride. That woman, Countess Markovitch, was one of the leaders of the rebellion, but she wasn't executed. She was from County Sligo and a childhood friend of Yeats. He describes her charitable work for the poor, that woman's days spent in ignorant goodwill. She was renowned for her beauty, and we get a sense that Yeats regrets her change. He chastises her for arguing politics so vehemently that her voice grew shrill. The once beautiful aristocratic horsewoman from his sacred Sligo has been destroyed by revolutionary zeal. This shrillness of her voice is contrasted with her sweet singing that he remembers from his youth. He describes how this man, Pierce, rode winged horse. This is an allusion to Pegasus, the Greek mythological winged horse and muse of poetry. This other, John MacDonagh, was a teacher at Pierce's school, St Enda's, where Yeats attended. He laments over the tragic loss of this poet, scholar and author, who, in his view, was approaching his best work, or as he puts it, coming into his force. Of both of these poets, Pierce and MacDonagh, he observes that they might have been better off remaining educators and writers. Finally, this other man, John MacBride, was executed. He had married Yeats's love Maud Gonne in 1903, but they separated a few years later and were estranged at the time of his execution. He was abusive to her, and this explains Yeats's description of MacBride as loathsome and a drunk, vainglorious lout. The conjunction yet in the line, yet I number him in this song, shows us that he's struggling with his past conceptions and ambivalent feelings about the rebels and the rising itself. Yeats's description of MacBride is very significant because it signals to the reader the transformation from comedy to tragedy that I referred to earlier. He writes, "He too has resigned his part in the casual comedy. He too has been changed in his turn." Then, finally, comes the refrain at the end of the stanza, reminding us of Yeats' sense of awe, recognition and humility in response to the rising, as he recognises the power of the actions of these individuals. The third stanza is very different from the rest of the poem. There is an absence, for starters, of the ballad refrain and the first-person pronoun, but it is still a beautiful and melodic stanza. This musical quality is created by the rhyme, rhythm and repetition of the stanza. The focus is on the natural world rather than the socio-political world of the other stanzas. Yeats departs from realism into symbolism. Another significant difference is that there is active change in this paragraph through the use of active present tense verbs rather than passive ones. Yeats's love of the pastoral is evident in this stanza. The material world meant little to his imagination, so he found the sources of his imagery in anima mundi, or world soul, the intrinsic connection between all living things, an idea which originated with Plato. And we see this through his visual imagery of the stone, the stream, the horse, the clouds, and the moorhens and moorcocks. There is a beauty and fluidity in the movement of the natural elements, the tumbling cloud, the horse hoof slides, a horse plashes, the moorhens dive, the moorcocks call. Our eyes are drawn up and down the landscape and around from the stream to the horse, to the rider, to the birds, to the clouds, and back to the stream. This forward and backward movement is reinforced by Yeats's use of chiasmus in minute by minute they change, and then later changes minute by minute. The most important symbol in this stanza, however, is the stone, which represents that implacable will that chooses death instead of life. The unnaturally fixed stone causes violence. It troubles the flowing water. It is connected, yet it disrupts the stream. The pastoral environment is meant to convey above all the peacefulness of the natural world. But natural order encompasses movement and transformation. This stanza is about change, the world of change, movement, history, which he sees fanaticism and rebellion, the fixed stone, as blocking. The metre and rhythm of the stanza represent change. They drive us forward, but the rhyme and repetition remind us of the fixed. The petrification of the stone contrasts with the movement of the rest of the features of the landscape. This can be seen as an indictment of fanaticism. He writes that the stone troubles the stream. On the other hand, Kibbard, in Inventing Ireland, the Literature of a Modern Nation, asserts that without the stone, the stream, which can represent society or government, is inactive. He claims that without that stone, in its fixity, no ripples could vibrate at all. The stone symbolises the firmness of all the purpose of strength and mind of the patriots. The troubling of the revolution is necessary if there is ever to be real change in the life of the nation, or the stream. Thus, Yeats's stance is ambivalent. Is he supporting or opposing the rebels? It seems that this stanza conveys his own admiring but troubled assessment of the value of the rising. Interestingly, Wendler observes that Yeats is drawing a contrast between himself and the rebels. She describes it as a contrast between ideological fixity and mobility of mind. We now move to the fourth and final stanza, which can be seen in two very differing ways. It could be seen as a condemnation of the actions of the rebels or an immortalising of the rebels. Perloff asserts that Yeats immortalises the rebels not as heroes in the abstract, but agents of change. I'll allow you to decide. Yeats uses the interesting poetic device of rhetorical questions. There's a temptation for the reader to answer these, but we can't. He has deliberately placed this series of rhetorical questions in the final stanza where he should be coming to conclusions, but instead he's asking more questions. Oh, when may it suffice? What is it but nightfall? Was it needless death after all? What if excess of love bewildered them till they died? This shows his ability to question himself and to change the way he thinks. Yeats is prepared to consider the beauty not previously recognised. He's not afraid to ask these challenging questions, reminding us again of Wendler's mobility of the imaginative mind. In History and Myth in Yeats's Easter 1916, Terry Eagleton states that these are the questions that have to be asked of all war poetry and can never truthfully be answered. This reinforces Yeats's ambivalence and his questioning of whether or not it was worth it. This is the question that plagues him. Were their lives sacrificed for a reason, or would Home Rule have been passed anyway, and it was all for nothing? For this reason, while he aims to mythologise the rebels, he is concerned about celebrating these events. He states that too long a sacrifice can make a stone of the heart. Here he is referring to the long history of the Irish plight. He is implying that this patriotism, this total dedication, petrifies the heart and creates a coldness and inhumanity. He asks, oh, when may it suffice? The interjection, oh, intensifies his concern and sounds almost like a prayer. He is asking when will the British rule end? In this stanza, Yeats makes a personal connection with the rebels when he asks, what if excess of love bewildered them till they died? something he understood too well because of his unreciprocated, passionate love of Maud Gonne. Yeats uses the cliché of sleep as death, but then decides not to sweeten it when he writes, "No, no, not night, but death." In the next line he asks, was it meaningless death after all? He then goes on to say that England may keep faith for all that is said and done, referring to the Home Rule which will be put in place after World War I. These two lines imply that this change was already occurring and the sacrifices of the rebels were not necessary. Ireland was already heading towards independence. There's an almost patronising tone in the image of the mother murmuring her child's name at the end of a rigorous day of play when they are safely asleep. The limbs that had run wild refer to a foolish child out of control in play, perhaps the way he views the fanaticism of the rebels. But the murmuring of their names suggests that he believes that they ought to be remembered, and he later gives them more weight. I write it out in a verse, MacDonagh and McBride and Connolly and Pearce. The delay caused by the dash preceding the names gives them even more weight and importance. We also notice that the jester's motley has now turned to green, the symbolic colour of Irish patriotism and Gaelic heritage. After hearing that analysis, I return to the question I posed at the beginning. Do you believe that Yeats was glorifying the rebels or condemning them? That concludes my analysis of Easter 1916. You will have noticed that while some literary devices were identified here, many that you discussed in your lesson on this poem may have been omitted to allow time for discussion of thematic concerns. I encourage you to go back to your workbooks and combine all of your notes to ensure a comprehensive analysis of the poem. Thank you and good luck.